And welcome to another Sportsnaut interview. I am Evan Groat, and this week we are joined by Las Vegas Raiders beat writer Vincent Bonsignore, who covers the Raiders for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and we're happy to have Vinny here joining us. It's shaping up to be another really busy and another really important offseason for the Raiders, as they are one of 7 NFL teams right now who are looking to fill their head coaching vacancy, as well as the general manager position for the Raiders. So let's start right there with our conversation, Vinny. I want to start with the general manager job. There's been several reports out there that the Raiders have requested interviews with many different front office members from around the league. Ed Dodds is one of them. Tom Telesco, formerly with the Chargers. Trey Brown with the Bengals. There's a couple of others as well. What I'm interested to get some of your thoughts on is if Mark Davis should decide to hire the general manager first, which it looks like that's going to be the case, will that give us some insight into who the next head coach could possibly be?
Yeah, probably. Although I know, in the interview process with the general manager, I'm sure he's sharing his thoughts, and the team that are conducting the interview are sharing their thoughts, and also I'm sure picking the brain of the general managers in terms of who they may be interested in and the reasons why. So this first step is a way to gauge interest, way to gauge ideas, listen to other ideas, get a sampling of what the thought process might be out there from the various people that are involved. But I do think there's probably some connection in terms of who they hire as the general manager. That might be a telltale sign of who they may be leaning toward as a head coach. Of course, always leaving open the strong possibility that it's going to end up being Champ Kelly, and Antonio Pierce at the end of the day as well.
Absolutely. Champ Kelly very much still in the running there. Let's move over to the head coach. And I'm just going to rip the Band-Aid off here with this one. There's been a lot of chatter recently about Jim Harbaugh and the possibility of him leaving Michigan to come back to the NFL. We haven't heard much about that since Monday when Michigan won the national championship. I do expect that conversation to heat up here again the next couple of days. Now, the Raiders players in the locker room has come out in full support of their interim head coach, Antonio Pierce, who did a very good job with the Raiders given the circumstances that he was put into. But it's also, at the same time, it's very difficult to ignore the track record of success that Jim Harbaugh has had at every stop along the way. So what is your thoughts on Jim Harbaugh, the candidate for the Raiders job, if he decides to leave Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's always going to be some risk, involved when you make a head coaching hire. And I guess, I don't know if risk is the right word, but there's the possibility that it's not going to work out, right, for various reasons. And one of the things you try to do when you make a hire is to eliminate as many of those concerns as possible and reduce the risk of it not working out as much as you possibly can, knowing full well there's still no guarantees. But when you look at Jim Harbaugh's resume and his history and his track record and everything that he's been a part of, this is a guy that's been a head coach continuously since the mid 2000s or so, 2008, 2009, going back to his days at San Diego University. By the way, I keep hearing people talk about saying that he coached at San Diego State. Two different schools, and I know the people in San Diego get fired up when we make that mistake. So San Diego University, then Stanford, then the 49ers, and now Michigan for the last almost 10 years. So this is a guy that's been doing it at a high level continuously for quite some time, been part of rebuilds, has hired staffs, has had to, has seen staff members leave for greener pastures or other jobs and had to replace them. Had to do complete turnovers in rosters, especially when you're talking about at Michigan, having coached there for almost a decade. So if you're thinking about a candidate that represents the fewest risks, the fewest concerns, I think Jim Harbaugh checks off pretty much all of those boxes. And not to take anything away from Antonio Pierce, because I honestly do think the world of him, and I think there's a good chance he gets this job. But there are still some inherent risks in hiring Antonio, given his lack of track record. This is somebody that's been coaching in the NFL for 2 years, mostly as a linebacker coach. Prior to that, a couple of years at Arizona State, and prior to that, he was a coach in high school. He's never had to put a staff together. He's never had to oversee a rebuild. He's never had to make hiring, when people leave, filling those positions. He's never had to come up with a full training camp schedule. He's never had to express his philosophy on the strength and conditioning, the nutrition, the travel, all of the things that are associated with being a head coach would be completely new to him, as it would be for any assistant coach that you would hire, no matter what job you're talking about in terms of the head coaching jobs that are out there. So, again, when you look at Jim Harbaugh, all of those, he's already been there, done that, and proven it. So when you're thinking about mitigating concerns, he would be somebody that mitigates most of your concerns.
Yeah, and I think that anyone who is looking at this objectively would have to agree with your points there. And I'm glad you brought up the word risk, because I think at this point, with the misses that Mark Davis has had, at least in his last two hires, he has to get this one right, because this organization can't afford to continue to have these types of losing seasons year after year after year. And I think, moving on to a kind of a slightly different topic here, I think one of the interesting things, this reminds me of what the Raiders just went through 2 years ago. Now, I just mentioned the support that Antonio Pierce is getting from the locker room. Max Crosby and Davante Adams have given really strong endorsements. It was the same situation 2 years ago when then interim head coach Rich Bisaccia was in place and led the Raiders to the playoffs. He was getting he was getting those same strong endorsements from players within the locker room. I'm wondering, do you think that weighs on the mind of Mark Davis as he has to go through this very similar situation again just 2 years later?
I mean, I don't know if it weighs on his mind. He's going to listen to them and give them a voice and honor that voice and respect that voice. But I don't think that he's gonna. It's going to be the end all be all. You can't let the players make the decision, and the reason is because more than ever, the NFL is now a transient type of a business. I mean, if you're really being honest, who are the players on the roster that you're going to truly listen to? Not to say that you're not going to you hang up the phone if somebody else calls, or if anybody on the team calls, you're going to give them that respect. But who do you truly listen to the most? And that would probably be Davante Adams and Max Crosby. And, both players have their hearts in the right place, and both players are going to share their thoughts as honestly as they possibly can. But the fact of the matter is, even in both of their cases, there's no guarantee how much longer they're going to be with the Raiders. Contracts come up, things happen, whatever the case might be. And that's true of the entire, roster. If you go back just a few years ago and think about how much this roster has changed just in 2 years or so, it's pretty dramatic. So you have to also keep that in mind, that these players are going to change eventually and change over. And there's going to be new players that have, if Antonio Pierce is no longer the head coach, that will have no recollection of Antonio Pierce. So if you're Mark Davis and you're the Raiders, like any other organization, you'll listen to your players, but you have to make a decision that you feel is the best for the decision, not just for 2024 or 2025, but you're hoping that you're making a decision that might last for the next decade or so. And that really has to be more at the forefront of what you're thinking and what you're considering and what you're putting into the decision-making process.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you make of the news that we got on Wednesday that the Raiders have blocked defensive coordinator Patrick Graham from interviewing with another NFL team that requested permission to do so? The fans out there are going to dissect and analyze every decision and move that is made in the next couple of weeks. Do you think that move signals that maybe things are lining up for Antonio Pierce to be retained as the head coach?
I think it lines up to that remains a strong possibility. And if so, they would probably like to have Patrick Graham, or obviously they would like to have Patrick Graham remain as defensive coordinator. It could also lead to that's somebody that they want to be here, regardless of who the head coach is, and at least present that opportunity to whoever that next coach is. If it's not Antonio Pierce, and let's just say it's Jim Harbaugh, you as Mark Davis and as your organization say, hey, we really like what's going on defense. What do you think about Patrick Graham remaining as defensive coordinator? And at the very least, it gives the new head coach a choice to make, but also you haven't lost Patrick Graham in the process. So it gives him a little bit of control over that end of it. Now, he may leave as a head coach anyway, and that the point becomes moot for whoever the head coach is. But I don't know if it signals that for sure this is Antonio Pierce. It signals that they would like to have Patrick Graham be in the mix for the new head coach, even if it is Antonio Pierce, to give strong consideration to. And at that point, it becomes the head coach's decision, unless there's an agreement that's made. If we hire you, you're keeping, Patrick Graham. We've seen that before. Kellen Moore, the offensive coordinator with the Dallas Cowboys, remained on after the Cowboys brought in Mike McCarthy, and it was kind of a mandate. It didn't last very long, so it tells you sometimes how that can go. But I don't think it signals anything for sure about Antonio Pierce.
Yeah, now the last time, 2 years ago, when Mark Davis was looking to hire a head coach and a general manager, it was a very thorough process. It kind of dragged on, interviewed a lot of candidates for both positions. What do you think we're looking at in terms of a timeline? When do you expect a decision to be made, and how that process will work out here in the next couple of weeks?
If we go, first of all, per the guidelines, through the NFL, especially with the head coaching position, there's really no chance to do in-person interviews until after, I think it's next week, or maybe even the week after. And those in-person interviews, are really important, because by league rule you have to have in-person interviews, not virtual, which they can start doing now, but those in-person interviews with at least two minority candidates from outside of your building. There's a timeline on that. So because of that, you can't just hire somebody like right now. So therefore, there is going to be a little bit of a process, which I actually think is a healthy thing for a lot of reasons. And one, for Mark Davis and the Raiders, by proxy, by circumstance, it allows them to kind of sit back and move away from just the emotion of the season that just concluded, and making a decision, maybe a rash decision or a rushed decision, to bring somebody back or not, based on just the results and where you were feeling right after the immediate aftermath of the season. It kind of allows everybody to take a little bit of a deep breath, go through this process, and I think make a more informed decision, and a less, in contrast to a more emotional decision. But if based on recent history and based on the guidelines, I would imagine that this probably gets wrapped up somewhere the last week of January, I would say.
Okay. We're chatting with Vinny Bonsignore, Raiders beat writer for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I just got two more questions I want to ask you related to the roster and some of the decisions that will have to be made with that in the next couple of weeks and months. Josh Jacobs, let's start with him. Played on the one-year deal this year. Had a kind of a disappointing end to his season, as he did miss the last 4 games with a quad injury. Do you think it's possible Josh Jacobs played his last game for the Raiders?
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely have to, consider that possibility, and maybe less to do with Josh and more to do with Zamir White did in the 4 games that he played in relief of Josh Jacobs. Just a shy under 400 yards. I think he finished with 395 or 397, somewhere around there. So almost 100 yards a game in the 4 games that he was his replacement. I thought got better the more he played. And let's be realistic about this. Zamir White, I think, showed that he's got RB1 capabilities, provided he stays healthy, but he definitely can produce. And you look at the contract, and I think he's scheduled to make about $1 million next year. And you contrast that to the $11 million that Josh Jacobs played for. And if the Raiders were to go down the franchise tag route again, well, that's scheduled to be $11.3 million next year. So you can start doing the math and start thinking about, all right, if the Raiders are comfortable with Zamir White replacing Josh as the running back and letting Josh walk, now you have $10 million or so. You take Zamir's $1 million contract, and then also think about the $10 million that they're getting back to be able to now allot to another position. That becomes pretty appealing. Especially, you know how difficult it is to manage the money and manage the salary cap and have the money available to go build your team out. So that becomes a compelling reason for the Raiders to say, thank you, Josh, but we're moving on from you and go with the cheaper and maybe just as good an option in Zamir White.
Yeah, and unfortunately for running backs, in the NFL, that's just the nature of the business, and also playing that position, the teams are often looking to, as you said, save a little money and in this case get a little bit younger as well. Now, after the decisions that will be made on the head coach and the general manager, the next big question mark for the Raiders heading into the 2024 season is who's going to play quarterback, and that's a very big question mark. The Raiders pick 13th overall in round 1 of the draft. It's a very good draft class if you need a quarterback. What do you think the plan will be at quarterback next year for the Raiders?
Well, it's really interesting, and I think the Chicago Bears play into it one way or another, because one way or another, I think the Raiders are going to be picking up the phone and giving the Bears a call, whether that's to trade for Justin Fields if Justin Fields becomes available, or trading up to the number 1 pick if the Bears decide we're going to hold on to Justin Fields and now we've got this number 1 pick and now we're going to put that up for sale and try to get a whole bunch of draft picks compensation to build around Justin Fields. So one way or another, I think there's going to be a conversation between the Bears and the Raiders. So that's one possibility. Maybe it's Justin Fields, maybe it's the top pick in the draft. If for whatever reason that's not a possibility or becomes too prohibitive to make the trade up or for Justin Fields, then there's also possibilities below the Chicago Bears. You keep hearing things that maybe the Giants are going to stay with Daniel Jones and pass on a quarterback this year. Well, they're drafting in a position that would probably be in that range of one of the quarterbacks that's coming out. Jaden Daniels, Michael Penix, maybe somebody like that. So I think there's going to be multiple ways for the Raiders to be aggressive and to bring in another quarterback, which I think is essential. I think Aiden O'Connell I think he's got starting characteristics, but I don't know if the ceiling for him is something that you want to wait around for, because maybe the ceiling is just exactly kind of what we saw this year, a guy that can win you a few games, but a guy that may cost you a few games. There's just a lot of inconsistency. A lot of things have to go right for him to be good. Whereas there's other quarterbacks that, including quarterbacks that are in this draft and maybe a Justin Fields, that, things don't necessarily have to be as perfect for them to be able to play really well and maybe help lead you to some wins. So I think it's a question that the Raiders are going to ask. And the final thing I'll add about that is I think the Raiders are in a good position to be aggressive, even if the cost is pretty high, and it will be, to move up, to get one of the top prospects in this draft, as opposed to just last year and the year before that, where you looked at the Raiders roster going into any given offseason, and there were just so many holes. It was like Swiss cheese on the defense. Well, they're going to need a couple of defensive linemen. They're going to need a couple of linebackers. They're going to need a couple of cornerbacks, safeties, offensive line, wide receivers, as opposed to now this year where you look at that defense and short of a couple of guys on the interior of the defensive line and Amik Robertson, guys who I think they were going to be able to bring back at nominal costs, the defense is pretty much intact, and you can make a case for bringing it back entirely, the same starting 11 next year, and being okay with that if you're a fan or if you're the Raiders. I know the offensive line is probably going to need some tinkering, but I think there's ways and there's cash and there's cap space to be able to address that maybe in free agency. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that now more than at any time that I've covered this team, I think the Raiders can afford to give up some draft assets to move up and go get their quarterback, because I think the rest of the roster is pretty much in place and ready to go. Look, ask yourself this question. If CJ Stroud were coming out this year and you had, as the Raiders, this roster, how good do you think C.J. Stroud and the Raiders would be next year with even a rookie C.J. Stroud on this team with Jacoby Myers and Michael Mayer and Devontae Adams and Zamir White, the defense that you saw out there all year? It probably wouldn't look too bad, and it might have a chance to look pretty special. So I think because the roster is where it is right now, it's not perfect, but it's much more sound than it's been in the past. I think this is the time for the Raiders to do what they need to do to go up and get their quarterback.
Yeah, and I think Raider fans would totally agree with you. They would love to see that happen and finally get their franchise quarterback. And with all the high end quarterbacks that are in the draft and all the quarterback needy teams that are drafting, in the top 10 to 15, it should certainly make for a really exciting draft. And I'm looking forward to it. But Vinny Bonsignore, everybody of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, we thank you so much for the time, Vinny. You're doing a great job covering the team. We appreciate your insight and keep up all your great work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Evan.